Disclaimer. The following stories you are about to hear are purely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. They belong to the genre of creepypasta and Illuminati horror stories. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or real-life locations is entirely coincidental. These stories are not based on real events, and they are not intended to be interpreted as true accounts or factual representations. Viewer discretion is advised. I uncovered a dark web network dedicated to human cloning. I've always been one to explore the darkest corners of the internet. You know, those places that make you feel like you need a shower after just a few minutes of browsing. But this was different. What I found wasn't just another grotesque site or disturbing forum. It was something that shook me to my core and left me questioning the very fabric of humanity. It all started a few months ago. I was in one of my usual deep web haunts, looking for anything that would give me that thrill of uncovering the unknown. I came across a link in a hidden forum, one that promised to be the ultimate in human experimentation. My curiosity piqued. I clicked on it without a second thought. The link took me to a very basic web page with a single prompt: enter invitation code. I didn't have a code, but I wasn't going to give up that easily. I spent the next few weeks digging through every dark corner of the internet, searching for any mention of this site. Finally, I found a lead in a chat room. A user named Dr. Creep was selling invitation codes for an ungodly amount of Bitcoin. I was hesitant at first, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I made the purchase. With the code in hand, I returned to the site. My hands were shaking as I typed it in. The screen went black for a moment, then a new page loaded. It was still minimalistic, but now it had a list of links. At the top was a video titled Introduction. I clicked it. The video was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old camcorder. A man in a lab coat stood in front of the camera, his face obscured by shadows. He began speaking in a calm, almost soothing voice. Welcome. If you're here, you've been chosen to witness the future of humanity. We are the pioneers of a new world order, one where death is merely an inconvenience. Our work is secret, our methods controversial, but our results are undeniable. He went on to explain that they had perfected the art of human cloning, not just creating mindless copies, but exact replicas with memories and personalities intact. They could clone anyone from a single cell, and these clones were indistinguishable from the original person. As the video ended, I was left with a sense of dread. This wasn't just another dark web scam. It felt real. Too real. I clicked on the next link, which took me to a series of files. Each file was labeled with a name and a date. I opened the first one. It was a video of a man strapped to a table, screaming and thrashing as men in lab coats stood around him. They were injecting something into his arm. As the minutes passed, his screams turned to sobs, then to silence. His body went limp, and for a moment, I thought he was dead. But then his eyes opened, and he began to speak. He spoke of memories that weren't his, of feeling like he was trapped in someone else's body. The video ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. I continued to watch video after video, each more disturbing than the last. People being cloned against their will, their original selves tortured or killed. The clones were treated like lab rats, subjected to all kinds of horrific experiments. I felt sick, but I couldn't stop. I had to know more. One video in particular stood out. It showed a young woman, barely out of her teens, sitting in a small dark room. She was crying, begging to be let go. A man entered the room and handed her a mirror. She looked into it and screamed. The camera panned over her shoulder, and I saw why. Her face was covered in scars, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She didn't recognize herself. The man spoke to her in a cold, clinical tone. "You are not who you think you are. You are a clone. Your original self is dead. You belong to us now." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was beyond anything I had imagined. It wasn't just cloning. It was a complete violation of humanity. These people were being stripped of their identities, their very souls. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I spent the next few days trying to track down any information about the site or the people behind it. I found nothing. They were ghosts operating in the shadows. I was at a dead end, but I couldn't let it go. That's when I started receiving the messages. At first, they were just warnings to stop digging, but then they became more personal. They knew my name, my address, my family. I was being watched. I was in too deep. One night, I woke up to find my computer screen on, even though I was sure I had turned it off. A video was playing. It was me, sleeping in my bed. The timestamp showed it was from just a few minutes ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. They were in my house. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone, no evidence of a break-in. They told me it was probably just a prank, but I knew better. I was being hunted. I packed a bag and left town that night. I've been on the run ever since, moving from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I'm writing this now from a small motel room, hoping that someone will read it and understand the danger we're all in. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. Be careful what you look for on the internet. Some things are better left hidden. After that night, my life became a blur of paranoia and fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every shadow held someone lurking, waiting to strike. I changed my phone, wiped my computer, even switched cars. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were always one step behind me. I moved to a new city under a fake name, hoping to start fresh. I rented a small, dingy apartment in a rundown part of town, thinking it would be easier to blend in. I spent most of my days hiding indoors, afraid to go out, afraid that someone would recognize me. I was a ghost of my former self, a shell of the person I once was. But my curiosity, that damn curiosity, wouldn't let me rest. I needed to know more about this dark web network. Who were they? How were they operating without anyone noticing? I knew the risks, but I felt like I had no choice. I had to dig deeper. Using a VPN and a series of encrypted connections, I managed to access the site again. This time, I was more cautious, taking every possible precaution to cover my tracks. I noticed a new section had been added since my last visit. Field reports. I clicked on it, my heart pounding in my chest. The reports were detailed logs of the network's activities, written by various operatives. They described abductions, experiments, and the disposal of failed subjects. Each report was more horrifying than the last. People were being taken from their homes, from the streets, even from hospitals. They were drugged, transported to hidden facilities, and subjected to unspeakable horrors. One report caught my eye. It was about a young man who had been abducted from a university campus. The report described how he was cloned, his original self disposed of, and his clone placed back into society with no memory of what had happened. The clone was monitored closely, observed for any signs of a malfunction. The report ended with a chilling note. Subject exhibits no abnormalities. Integration successful. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't just happening in some remote lab. They were placing clones back into society, blending them in with the rest of us. How many of the people I saw on the streets every day were actually clones? How many had been taken, replaced, and forgotten? I knew I had to keep digging, but I needed help. I reached out to a few contacts I had made over the years, people who were just as deep into the dark web as I was. Most of them didn't respond, probably too scared to get involved, but one did. An old hacker friend who went by the alias Cypher. Cypher was a legend in the underground hacking community, known for his skills and his absolute discretion. If anyone could help me, it was him. I sent him everything I had, all the files and videos, along with a desperate plea for assistance. It took a few days, but he finally replied. Meet me, usual spot, midnight. The usual spot was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place we had used for meetups in the past. It was isolated, perfect for a clandestine meeting. I arrived early, nerves jangling, every sound making me jump. Cypher showed up right on time, a shadowy figure in a hoodie and sunglasses. We exchanged brief pleasantries before getting down to business. I handed him a flash drive with all the data I had collected, and he plugged it into his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he analyzed the files. "This is bad," he said after a few minutes. "Really bad. These guys are operating on a level I have never seen before. Their encryption, their security, it's military grade. Whoever they are, they've got serious resources." He paused, looking at me with a mix of concern and curiosity. "How did you even find this?" I explained everything, from the initial link to the invitation code to the videos and reports. Cypher listened intently, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. "All right," he said finally, "I'm in, but you need to understand, this isn't just some hacker group or criminal syndicate. This is something much bigger. We're talking government-level operations, black ops, stuff that can get us both killed if we're not careful." I nodded, fully aware of the risks, but I couldn't back down now. We spent the next few hours going through the data, trying to find any leads, any vulnerabilities we could exploit. Cypher managed to trace some of the communications back to a series of IP addresses scattered around the world, but they were all heavily masked, rerouted through dozens of proxies. We did find one potential lead though, a name that kept appearing in the reports. Project Lazarus. It seemed to be the code name for the entire cloning operation. We decided to focus our efforts on uncovering more about this project, hoping it would lead us to the people behind it. Over the next few weeks, Cypher and I worked tirelessly, hacking into databases, intercepting communications, anything we could do to gather more information. We found references to several facilities around the world, places where the cloning experiments were being conducted. One in particular stood out, a remote lab in the Siberian wilderness, heavily guarded and virtually impenetrable. But we also found something else, something even more disturbing. There were mentions of test subjects being prepared for a transfer. We couldn't find out where they were being taken, but the implication was clear. The network was expanding, and they were moving their operations to new locations. The more we uncovered, the more dangerous it became. We started receiving threats, both online and offline. One night, I found a bullet on my doorstep, a clear message that we were getting too close. Cypher had his own close calls, narrowly avoiding what he believed were attempts on his life. But we couldn't stop. We were too deep, and we knew too much. We had to see it through, no matter the cost. We were about to make our biggest breakthrough yet, a piece of information that could expose the entire operation. Then one night, Cypher disappeared. I had been trying to reach him for hours, but he wasn't responding. I went to our usual meeting spot, but there was no sign of him. His apartment was empty, his laptop gone. It was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. I was alone, terrified, and more determined than ever. They could come for me next, but I wasn't going to let them win. I had to expose the truth, to let the world know what was happening. That's when I found the final piece of the puzzle, the information that would blow the lid off the entire operation. But it came at a price I wasn't prepared to pay. My next post will detail that discovery and the terrifying consequences that followed. Cypher's disappearance shook me to my core. For days, I was in a state of shock, paranoia gripping me tighter with each passing hour. I moved to a new safe house, a dingy basement apartment that barely had enough light to read by. I felt like a cornered animal, every noise sending me into a state of heightened alert. Despite the fear, I couldn't stop. I owed it to Cypher and to all the victims of this monstrous network. I spent hours poring over every piece of data we had collected, looking for anything we might have missed. Then late one night, I found it. Buried deep in the encrypted files was a hidden folder. It was only by sheer luck and a bit of brute force hacking that I stumbled upon it. Inside the folder was a single document, heavily redacted but containing enough information to piece together the true scale of Project Lazarus. The document detailed an international conspiracy, a coalition of powerful entities working together under the radar. Governments, corporations, military organizations, all involved in the human cloning network. The goal was chillingly clear: to create a new class of human beings, perfectly obedient, utterly expendable, clones that could be used for anything from labor to warfare, with no rights, no autonomy. Even more disturbing were the details of the cloning process. They weren't just creating physical duplicates. Advanced neurotechnology was used to implant memories and personality traits, essentially molding the clones into whatever their creators desired. The original humans were often kept alive, subjected to endless torture and experimentation to refine the process. Their minds were harvested for data, their bodies used as mere vessels. The document also mentioned the existence of sleeper agents, clones that were indistinguishable from regular people, placed in strategic positions around the world. These clones were programmed to activate on command, carrying out missions ranging from espionage to assassination. The implications were terrifying. How many world leaders, influential figures, or even ordinary people were secretly clones, ticking time bombs, waiting for their orders? As I read through the document, a feeling of hopelessness washed over me. This was so much bigger than I had ever imagined. Exposing this would be like trying to topple a giant with a slingshot, but I knew I had to try. Cypher had risked everything to get this information, and I couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. With the document in hand, I set about trying to contact the media. I knew it was risky, but I needed someone with a platform big enough to get the word out. I reached out to several journalists using encrypted emails and burner phones. Most didn't respond, likely thinking I was just another conspiracy nut. But one did. Her name was Laura, an investigative reporter known for her fearless exposés on corruption and crime. I managed to arrange a meeting in a public place, a busy cafe where I felt relatively safe. I showed her the document, laid out everything I knew. Her eyes widened as she read through the pages, her face growing pale. This is insane," she whispered. "If this is true, it's the story of the century." "It is true," I insisted, "and they're willing to kill to keep it secret. My friend, Cypher, he's gone. They took him because we were getting too close." Laura looked around nervously, then nodded. "Okay, I'll take this to my editor. We'll need to verify everything, but if we can prove it..." Before she could finish, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and froze. "I have to go," she said abruptly, standing up. "I'll be in touch." She left quickly, leaving me sitting there with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I paid for my coffee and left, scanning the streets for any sign of danger. I didn't trust anyone anymore, not after everything I had seen. The next day, I saw the news. Laura had been found dead, an apparent victim of a car accident, but I knew better. It was too convenient, too sudden. They had silenced her, just like they had silenced Cypher. I was on my own again, more isolated than ever. But now I had the document, the proof. I just needed to find a way to get it out there without getting myself killed in the process. I considered going to the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. They were probably in on it too, or at least compromised in some way. That's when I remembered an old contact, someone who owed me a favor. A former military intelligence officer turned whistleblower, known only as Red. If anyone could help me, it was him. I reached out through a secure channel, praying he would respond. A few hours later, I got a reply. A location and a time. No words, just coordinates. I packed my things and headed out, hoping this wasn't a trap. The meeting point was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, a place that looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. I arrived early, hiding in the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. Finally, I saw him. Red was a tall, imposing figure, his face obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses. "Long time," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "What's so important you'd risk contacting me?" I handed him the document, explaining everything as briefly as I could. He read through it, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. "This is big," he said finally. "Bigger than anything I've ever seen. You're right to be scared. They won't stop until you're dead." "I need to get this out there," I said. "I need your help." Red nodded. "I have some contacts, people who can help, but it's going to be dangerous. We'll need to move fast, stay one step ahead of them." We spent the next few hours planning our next move, devising a strategy to get the information to the right people without getting caught. Red had access to a network of underground journalists and activists, people who specialized in exposing the truth, no matter the cost. But as we were finalizing our plans, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a glint of light, the reflection of a lens. Someone was watching us. Before I could react, gunshots rang out, shattering the silence. Red grabbed me, pulling me to the ground as bullets whizzed past us. "They found us," he shouted. "We need to go, now." We scrambled to our feet, running through the factory, dodging bullets and trying to find an exit. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it hard to see. But we couldn't stop. Not now. We burst through a side door, emerging into the night. Red led me to a waiting car, and we sped off into the darkness, leaving the factory and our attackers behind. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. This was far from over, but for now, we had escaped. As we drove, Red turned to me. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We're in this together now. We won't stop until we bring them down." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. We had the truth on our side, and we were going to expose it, no matter what. But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. We drove through the night, Red taking back roads and avoiding main highways to throw off anyone who might be tailing us. The atmosphere in the car was tense, both of us on high alert. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Red's calm demeanor was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a safe house deep in the woods. It was a small cabin, barely more than a shack, but it was stocked with supplies and had a secure internet connection. Red explained that it was one of several hideouts he had prepared over the years, a relic of his days in military intelligence. We settled in, and Red immediately got to work, contacting his network of journalists and activists. He encrypted the document, breaking it into pieces and sending it to different contacts with instructions on how to reassemble it. Each piece was accompanied by a detailed explanation of what Project Lazarus was and why it needed to be exposed. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside, set my nerves on edge. I barely slept, keeping one eye open for any sign of danger. Red seemed to sense my anxiety and tried to reassure me. "They're powerful, but they're not invincible," he said. "We've taken precautions. We'll get this out." The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. We monitored the internet, watching for any sign that our contacts had received the information and were starting to act on it. Slowly, we began to see results. Independent news sites and blogs started publishing stories about the human cloning network, citing anonymous sources and leaked documents. It wasn't a full-scale expose yet, but it was a start. But then, things took a dark turn. One by one, the journalists and activists we had contacted began to disappear. Some were reported missing, others found dead under suspicious circumstances. It was clear that the network was trying to silence anyone who knew too much. Red and I knew we were running out of time. We needed to find a way to get the story to a wider audience before we became the next targets. That's when Red came up with a plan. "There's a public event coming up," he said. "A tech conference, big names, lots of media coverage. We could use it to our advantage." His plan was risky. We would attend the conference and find a way to leak the document to the press, right under the noses of the network. It was a long shot, but it was our best chance to get the story out before it was too late. We spent the next few days preparing, forging credentials and disguises to get into the conference unnoticed. Red taught me how to blend in, how to spot and avoid surveillance. By the time the conference rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves, but ready to do whatever it took. The conference was held in a massive convention center, packed with tech enthusiasts, journalists, and industry professionals. We moved through the crowds, keeping our heads down and avoiding eye contact. Red had identified a few key journalists who were known for their investigative work. and our plan was to slip them copies of the document during the event. We managed to make contact with one of them, a reporter named Alex, who worked for a major news outlet. Red handed him a USB drive, explaining briefly what it contained and urging him to look at it as soon as possible. Alex seemed skeptical but took the drive, promising to review it later. We continued our mission, trying to get the document into the hands of as many journalists as we could. But as the day went on, I started to feel that familiar sense of dread creeping back. I scanned the crowd, looking for any sign that we had been made. That's when I saw them. Two men in dark suits, moving through the crowd with purpose. Their eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, but I could tell they were scanning the room, looking for someone, looking for us. I nudged Red, pointing them out. His expression hardened, and he nodded. "Time to go," he said. We made our way to the nearest exit, trying to blend in with the throngs of people leaving the conference. But as we stepped outside, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see one of the men in suits, his grip like a vice. "Don't make a scene," he said, his voice low and menacing. Red reacted instantly, pulling me away and shoving the man back. We sprinted through the parking lot, dodging between cars, trying to put as much distance between us and our pursuers as possible. The sound of footsteps and shouts followed us, but we didn't stop. We reached Red's car and jumped in, speeding away from the conference center. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Red kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking for any sign of pursuit. "We need to disappear," he said. "They'll be looking for us now." We drove for hours, taking back roads and avoiding main highways. Finally, we reached another safe house, this one even more remote than the last. We spent the night in tense silence, both of us too exhausted and too scared to talk. The next morning, we checked the news. The document had been leaked, and several major news outlets were running with the story. The headlines were shocking. Human cloning network exposed. Government conspiracy unveiled. Dark web horror revealed. It was a small victory, but we knew the fight wasn't over. The network would be scrambling to cover their tracks, to silence anyone who could expose them further. We were still in danger, and so were the people we had contacted. Red and I knew we couldn't stop now. We had to keep moving, keep fighting, until the whole truth was out and the network was dismantled. It was a daunting task, one that seemed almost impossible, but we had come this far. There was no turning back. The news broke like a tidal wave. The story of the human cloning network spread across the globe, igniting a firestorm of outrage and fear. Governments denied involvement, corporations issued frantic statements, and the public was gripped by a mix of horror and disbelief. For a moment, it felt like we had won, that we had finally exposed the monstrous truth lurking in the shadows. But we knew better. The network was vast, and its roots ran deep. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and we were still their primary targets. Red and I moved to yet another safe house, this one an old cabin deep in the mountains. It was isolated, hard to reach, and nearly impossible to find without insider knowledge. We spent our days monitoring the news, watching the fallout from our revelations, and planning our next move. Then one night, the inevitable happened. We were sitting in the cabin, going over our notes and preparing another batch of documents to send to our contacts when the power went out. The sudden darkness was like a shroud, wrapping us in silence and fear. Generator must have gone out, Red muttered, but I saw the worry in his eyes. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside to check. I stayed inside, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound that might signal danger. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Then I heard it, a soft thud, followed by a muffled cry. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a heavy wrench, and crept toward the door. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. I peered outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Red was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. I stepped outside, moving cautiously, trying to stay in the shadows. The night was eerily quiet. The only sound, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move. I turned, wrench raised, ready to strike, but it was too late. Something heavy slammed into the back of my head, and I fell to the ground, pain exploding through my skull. The world went black. I woke up in a small, dimly lit room. My hands were tied behind my back, and my head throbbed with pain. Red was next to me, unconscious but breathing. The room was bare, except for a single door and a camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking ominously. The door opened, and two men walked in. They were dressed in the same dark suits as the men at the conference, their faces blank and expressionless. One of them spoke, his voice cold and detached. "You've caused us a lot of trouble," he said, "but it ends here." They dragged Red and me out of the room and into a long corridor. The walls were lined with metal doors, each one marked with a number. I could hear muffled sounds coming from behind some of them, cries, whispers, the hum of machinery. We were in one of their facilities. They brought us to a large room filled with medical equipment. In the center was a table with restraints and various instruments that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber. They threw Red onto the table and began strapping him down. He woke up, groggy and confused, struggling against his bonds. "What are you doing?" I shouted, trying to free myself from their grip. The man who had spoken earlier turned to me, his expression unchanged. "You've interfered with our work. Now you're going to become part of it." They injected Red with something, and he went limp. I watched in horror as they prepared for whatever gruesome procedure they had planned. But before they could begin, the door burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. It was like a scene from a movie. The armed men quickly subdued the scientists, cuffing them and securing the room. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, approached me and cut my bindings. "You're safe now," he said. "We're with a special task force investigating the network." I could hardly believe it. After all this time, after all the fear and paranoia, we had finally been found by the right people. They freed Red and began tending to him, administering medical aid and preparing to transport us to a secure location. Over the next few days, we were debriefed and given protection. The task force was a covert unit, working to dismantle the network from the inside. They had been tracking the cloning operation for years, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to strike. Our revelations had provided the catalyst they needed. With the task force's help, we continued to expose the network, revealing its full extent and bringing those responsible to justice. It was a long and arduous process, filled with danger and setbacks, but we persevered. The network was eventually dismantled, its leaders arrested, and its facilities shut down. The world learned the full truth about the horrors of Project Lazarus, and steps were taken to ensure it could never happen again. As for Red and me, we went our separate ways, each trying to rebuild our lives after the nightmare we had endured. The scars ran deep, and the memories haunted us, but we had done what we set out to do. In the end, we were survivors. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side. And while the world was a safer place, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some shadowy corner of the earth, the remnants of the network were still out there, waiting for the chance to rise again. But we would be ready. We would always be ready. I worshipped the Illuminati, trothed the dark web. Now they want my sister. I guess I have no other choice. Hey Reddit, I don't even know where to begin. This might be the last thing I ever write, but I need to get this off my chest. I've been involved in something so dark and twisted that it's ruined my life. And I need to warn you all. I worship the Illuminati through the dark web, and when they wanted to do a real-life ritual, they asked me to sacrifice my sister. After what they did, I have no other choice. It all started about a year ago. I was your typical internet junkie, spending countless hours browsing forums, watching videos, and exploring the dark web. I was always drawn to the weird and unexplained. One night, I stumbled upon a forum that promised enlightenment and power through the Illuminati. I was curious, and I thought it was all just an elaborate role-playing game. So, I joined. The initiation was simple at first. I had to do small tasks like watching disturbing videos and answering riddles. It was creepy, but also thrilling. As I progressed, the tasks became more intense and personal. I had to share my deepest secrets, perform strange rituals alone at home, and even hurt myself. But the promise of power and knowledge kept me going. Eventually, I was invited to a private chat room with the higher-ups. They claimed to be powerful members of the Illuminati, and they spoke of rituals that could bring unimaginable power. I was hooked. They convinced me that if I wanted to truly be one of them, I needed to prove my loyalty through a real-life ritual. That's when they told me I had to sacrifice someone I loved. At first, I thought they were joking, but they assured me they were deadly serious. They gave me a week to decide. I was horrified and tried to back out, but they knew everything about me. They knew where I lived, where my family lived, and they promised that if I didn't comply, they would come after me and my family. I spent days agonizing over what to do. My little sister, Emily, was the sweetest person I knew. She was only 12, full of life and dreams. I couldn't imagine harming her, but the threats from the Illuminati were relentless. I became paranoid, seeing their eyes in every shadow and hearing their whispers in every silence. I felt trapped, with no way out. One night, they sent me detailed instructions for the ritual. I was to take Emily to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. There, I'd find a hidden room where the ritual would take place. They sent me a list of items I'd need: a ceremonial knife, candles, and a book of incantations. They said they would be watching and that if I tried to run, they would kill us both. I was losing my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at Emily, I felt a deep, gut-wrenching guilt, but I was too terrified to defy the Illuminati. On the night of the ritual, I felt like a robot, mechanically going through the motions. I told Emily we were going on an adventure, and she followed me innocently, her trust in me unwavering. When we arrived at the warehouse, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Inside, it was cold and damp, with the smell of decay. We made our way to the hidden room, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was lit by a single flickering light bulb. I set up the candles and opened the book, my vision blurring with tears. Emily stood there, looking confused and scared. She asked me what we were doing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I recited the incantations, my voice trembling. The air grew thick, and I felt a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. Then I picked up the knife. Emily saw it and began to cry, begging me to stop, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this nightmare, and I had to see it through. As I raised the knife, I felt something take over me, a force beyond my control. I brought the knife down, and the world went black. When I came to, Emily was lying on the floor, lifeless. The room was filled with shadows, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. A voice whispered in my ear, telling me I had done well. They said I was one of them now, that I had power and protection, but all I felt was emptiness and horror. I stumbled out of the warehouse, covered in blood, and drove home in a daze. I don't remember much after that. I must have called the police because they arrived shortly after I got home. I was arrested and charged with murder. My parents were devastated, unable to comprehend what had happened. In prison, the Illuminati continued to haunt me. They sent me messages, reminding me of my loyalty and warning me not to betray them. I knew they were watching, waiting for me to comply with their next demands. I'm writing this from my cell, knowing that my time is running out. The Illuminati want another sacrifice, and this time it's me. I can't escape them. I don't know if anyone will believe this, but I had to tell my story. I had to warn you all. Don't get involved with the dark web. Don't let curiosity lead you down the path I took. The Illuminati are real, and they will destroy everything you love. This is my confession, my warning, my last plea for forgiveness. May God have mercy on my soul. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need to keep telling my story. After everything that happened, you might think the worst was over, but it wasn't. If anything, it got darker. The Illuminati's grip on my life tightened, and the guilt over what I did to Emily began to tear me apart. After my arrest, I was placed in solitary confinement, while the authorities tried to make sense of what I had done. My parents didn't understand. They thought I had lost my mind, and in a way, I had. The prison walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the whispers from the Illuminati were constant, reminding me of my duty and threatening my family if I spoke out. The first few days in solitary were the worst. I couldn't sleep, haunted by Emily's face every time I closed my eyes. Her innocent eyes, filled with confusion and fear, were burned into my memory. I couldn't escape the image of her lifeless body on that cold, dirty floor. The shadows in my cell seemed to move and shift, and I felt a presence watching me, waiting for me to break. One night, as I lay on the thin, uncomfortable mattress, I heard a familiar whisper. It was the same voice from the warehouse, the one that had told me I had done well. "You belong to us now," it said. "You are bound by blood." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I knew I wasn't alone in the cell. I tried to block out the voice, but it grew louder, filling my head with dark thoughts. It told me that I had no choice but to obey, that the Illuminati had plans for me. I was to be their vessel, their instrument of darkness. I was terrified, but I also felt a strange sense of power, like I was part of something bigger than myself. It was intoxicating and horrifying, at the same time. The guards noticed my deteriorating state and thought I was losing my mind. They brought in a psychiatrist, but I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't risk the Illuminati finding out. So I played along, pretending to be remorseful and sane, all while the voice in my head grew stronger. A few weeks into my confinement, I received a letter. There was no return address, but I knew who it was from. The letter was written in a strange ancient language, but I understood it perfectly. It was a message from the Illuminati, instructing me to prepare for another ritual. They wanted another sacrifice, and this time it had to be someone in the prison. I was horrified. How was I supposed to do this from inside a cell? The letter gave me detailed instructions, just like before. I was to lure a fellow inmate into a hidden part of the prison and perform the ritual. They promised that if I succeeded, I would be released and given even more power. If I failed, they would kill my family. I couldn't let them hurt my family, but the thought of killing again made me sick to my stomach. I spent days agonizing over what to do. The voice in my head kept urging me on, telling me it was the only way to save my loved ones and secure my place in the Illuminati. I was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. One night, I decided I had no choice. I had to follow through with the ritual. I befriended a new inmate named Mark. He was young, naive, and desperate for companionship. We would talk for hours during our limited free time, and he started to trust me. It made me sick to manipulate him, but I was desperate. I told Mark I had found a way out, a secret passage that led to freedom. He was skeptical at first, but I convinced him with my forced sincerity. We planned to escape during the night shift, when the guards were less vigilant. I felt a pit of dread in my stomach, knowing what I was about to do. The night of the escape, I led Mark to the hidden area of the prison. It was dark and musty, filled with the stench of decay. Mark looked around nervously, but he trusted me. I set up the candles and opened the book, just like I had with Emily. My hands shook as I recited the incantations, the air growing thick with tension. Mark started to panic, realizing something was wrong. He tried to run, but I grabbed him and forced him to stay. The voice in my head was screaming now, urging me to complete the ritual. I picked up the knife, my vision blurring with tears. Mark begged for his life, but I couldn't stop. I brought the knife down, and the world went black again. When I came to, Mark's body was lying in a pool of blood. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with energy, and the voice in my head congratulated me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder again, and I knew I had done their bidding. The power I felt was overwhelming, but so was the guilt. I had killed again, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the guards found me covered in blood, standing over Mark's body. They were horrified and confused, unsure of how I had managed to do this. I was placed in maximum security, but the Illuminati's grip on me was stronger than ever. They sent me messages reminding me of my loyalty and promising that my family was safe as long as I obeyed. I'm still in this hellhole, surrounded by the echoes of my sins. The Illuminati want more from me, and I know I have no choice but to comply. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I had to share this part of my story. If you're reading this, please, stay away from the dark web. Don't let the promise of power lure you into their grasp. I've lost everything, and there's no way out. May God have mercy on my soul. Hey Reddit, I'm back. I didn't think I'd make it this far, but I need to keep telling my story. My life has become a living nightmare, and the grip the Illuminati has on me is tightening every day. I don't know how much longer I can hold out, but I need to get this out while I still can. After Mark's death, the prison authorities were baffled and terrified. They had no idea how I managed to kill him, especially with the heightened security. They moved me to an isolation unit, hoping it would prevent any further incidents, but the isolation only made things worse. The voice in my head grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows in my cell seemed to come alive at night. The Illuminati kept sending me messages, reinforcing their control. They promised me protection and power, but all I felt was despair and guilt. My dreams were filled with the faces of Emily and Mark, their eyes accusing and full of pain. I could barely sleep, and when I did, it was a restless, haunted slumber. One night, the voice in my head told me it was time for another ritual. I was to sacrifice a god this time, someone who had been particularly cruel to me. The instructions were as detailed as ever, and the promise of power was dangled in front of me like a carrot. But I was reaching my breaking point. The thought of taking another life was unbearable, but the fear of what the Illuminati would do if I refused was even worse. I spent days agonizing over what to do. The god they wanted me to kill was named Jackson. He was a brute, taking pleasure in tormenting the inmates. He would beat us for the slightest infraction and taunt us with cruel words. I hated him, but the idea of killing him made me sick. The night of the ritual, I was a nervous wreck. I knew what I had to do, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. The voice in my head was relentless, urging me on, telling me I had no choice. I waited until Jackson was alone, patrolling a remote section of the prison. I approached him slowly, trying to keep my fear in check. Jackson sneered at me, ready to dish out another beating, but I acted quickly. I plunged the knife into his side, and his eyes widened in shock. He tried to fight back, but I overpowered him, driven by a mixture of terror and desperation. As he bled out on the floor, I recited the incantations, my voice trembling. The air grew thick, and I felt that same malevolent presence in the room. Jackson's body twitched, and I saw shadows moving around us, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. When it was over, I collapsed on the floor, exhausted and filled with horror at what I had done. The voice in my head congratulated me again, telling me I had done well. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I knew I was still under their control. The power I felt was fleeting, overshadowed by the crushing guilt and fear. The prison went into lockdown after Jackson's death. The guards were on edge, and the inmates were terrified. No one knew how I had managed to kill him, and rumors started to spread about my connection to the Illuminati. I was moved to an even more secure unit, isolated from everyone, but the isolation didn't help. The voice in my head was my constant companion, reminding me of my duty and the consequences of disobedience. I was losing my grip on reality, haunted by the faces of my victims and the dark presence that seemed to follow me everywhere. One day, I received another letter. It was written in the same ancient language, and it contained my next instructions. The Illuminati wanted me to recruit other inmates into their ranks, to spread their influence within the prison. They promised that if I succeeded, I would be granted more power and possibly even freedom. I was horrified. The thought of dragging others into this nightmare was unbearable, but I knew I had no choice. The Illuminati's threats were all too real, and I couldn't risk defying them. So, I started talking to the other inmates, carefully selecting those who seemed the most desperate and broken. I told them about the Illuminati, about the power and protection they offered. Some were skeptical, but others were intrigued. I shared the rituals with them, watching as they performed the same dark rites that had ensnared me. It felt like I was spreading a disease, corrupting their souls, just as mine had been corrupted. The prison began to change. Strange occurrences became more frequent, and the atmosphere grew darker. The guards were terrified, unable to understand what was happening. The inmates I had recruited became loyal to me, seeing me as a prophet of sorts. It was a twisted, sickening feeling of power, but I knew it was all a lie. The Illuminati's control over me was absolute, and I felt like a puppet on strings. I was haunted by the faces of Emily, Mark, and Jackson, their eyes accusing and filled with pain. I couldn't escape the darkness that surrounded me, and I knew that my time was running out. I'm writing this with shaking hands, knowing that the Illuminati's next demand will come soon. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I had to share this part of my story. If you're reading this, please stay away from the dark web and the promises of power it offers. It's a trap, and once you're caught, there's no escape. May God have mercy on my soul. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I don't know why I keep doing this, but writing it down somehow makes it feel more real. And maybe, just maybe, it will serve as a warning to others. My life has become a series of horrors, each one worse than the last, and the Illuminati's grip on me is like a vice that won't let go. After recruiting the other inmates, things in the prison got even darker. The rituals we performed seemed to draw something evil into the place. Shadows moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and everyone felt a constant sense of dread. The guards were terrified, and even the toughest inmates looked haunted. The Illuminati's influence was growing, and they had more demands. They wanted more sacrifices, more loyalty, and more control. I was their puppet, their vessel, and I felt like I was losing my mind. The voices in my head were louder, more insistent, and the presence that followed me was stronger. One night, I was woken by a noise in my cell. It was a low, guttural growl, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to pulse with energy, and I felt like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but the growl came again, closer this time. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, dark, and featureless, like a living shadow. Its eyes glowed red, and it reached out a hand towards me. I couldn't move, paralyzed with fear. The voice in my head screamed at me to obey, to kneel before this entity. I fell to my knees trembling, and the figure seemed to smile, though it had no mouth. It spoke to me in a language I couldn't understand, but I felt its meaning deep in my soul. It demanded my total obedience, my absolute loyalty, and promised me power and protection in return. I was terrified, but I nodded, unable to refuse. The figure placed its hand on my head, and I felt a surge of cold energy course through me. It was like ice and fire at the same time, and I screamed in pain. The figure disappeared, leaving me gasping on the floor, but I knew it was still watching, always watching. The next day, I received another letter. This time, it was different. The Illuminati wanted me to perform a ritual that would open a gateway, a portal to another realm. They promised that this would grant me ultimate power and freedom, but I was skeptical. I had seen too much, done too much, to believe their lies. But I had no choice. The voices in my head wouldn't let me refuse. They told me where to find the ingredients, how to draw the symbols, and what incantations to chant. It was complex and dangerous, and I knew that if I failed, the consequences would be dire. I spent days preparing, gathering everything I needed. The other inmates watched me with a mixture of fear and awe, their eyes hollow and haunted. They had become true believers, and they saw me as their leader, their guide into darkness. It made me sick, but I couldn't stop. The night of the ritual, I was a bundle of nerves. I drew the symbols on the floor of my cell, lit the candles, and began to chant. The air grew thick and cold, and I felt a presence pressing down on me. The shadows in the cell seemed to come alive, writhing and pulsing with energy. As I chanted, the symbols on the floor began to glow, and a dark, swirling vortex appeared in the center. It was like looking into the void, a portal to a place of darkness and despair. The voices in my head urged me on, telling me to step into the portal, to embrace the power it offered. I hesitated, fear gripping my heart, but the presence behind me was insistent, pushing me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped into the vortex, feeling a cold wind wrap around me. For a moment, I felt like I was falling, tumbling through endless darkness. When I emerged on the other side, I was in a place that defied description. It was dark and twisted, a landscape of nightmares. The ground was made of black, pulsating flesh, and the sky was a swirling mass of red and black clouds. I felt a sense of dread, knowing I had crossed into a realm of pure evil. The voices in my head were louder here, clearer. They told me to walk forward, to find the source of the power. I stumbled through the dark landscape, feeling eyes watching me from every direction. I knew I was being followed, but I couldn't see who or what was there. Finally, I came to a massive, ancient structure. It was a temple, made of dark stone and covered in strange, pulsing runes. The entrance loomed before me, a gaping maw of darkness. I felt a compulsion to enter, driven by the voices and the malevolent presence that had been guiding me all along. Inside the temple, the air was thick with the scent of decay and the whispers of countless souls. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt a sense of overwhelming dread. I walked through a maze of dark corridors, each step echoing with the screams of the damned. The shadows danced around me, flickering and shifting as if alive. I finally reached a central chamber, a vast, open space lit by eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the room was an altar, and atop it lay a book bound in what looked like human skin. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and I knew this was the source of the power the Illuminati had promised. The voices in my head grew louder, more insistent, urging me to approach the altar. My body moved on its own, as if controlled by some unseen force. I reached out and touched the book, feeling a surge of cold energy course through me. The book opened on its own, its pages filled with ancient, forbidden knowledge. As I read the incantations, the air around me began to swirl, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. A dark portal started to form above the altar, and from it emerged a figure cloaked in shadows. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its presence filled the room with a palpable sense of evil. "You have done well," the figure said, in a voice that seemed to resonate within my very soul. You have proven your loyalty and earned your place among us. I felt a twisted sense of pride, but also a deep, gnawing fear. The figure extended a hand towards me, and I felt a compulsion to take it. As our hands touched, I felt a flood of dark energy fill me, binding me to the Illuminati in a way that I knew I could never escape. You are now one of us, the figure said, but your journey is not yet complete. There is one final task you must perform. I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure explained what I had to do. I was to return to the mortal realm and bring forth another sacrifice, someone of great innocence and purity. Only then would I be granted the ultimate power and freedom I had been promised. The thought of taking another innocent life filled me with dread, but I knew I had no choice. The Illuminati's control over me was absolute, and I was bound by blood and darkness. I was a puppet in their hands, and I had to obey. The figure gestured towards the portal, and I stepped through, feeling the familiar sensation of falling through endless darkness. When I emerged, I was back in my cell, the symbols and candles still glowing faintly. The voices in my head were quieter now, but their presence was still strong. I spent days agonizing over what to do. The Illuminati wanted another sacrifice, and I knew I couldn't refuse. But the thought of taking another innocent life was unbearable. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. One night, I was woken by a noise outside my cell. It was the sound of soft footsteps, and I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Emily. I stared in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked just as I remembered, her eyes filled with innocence and confusion. "Why, brother?" she asked, her voice echoing with pain. "Why did you do it?" I tried to speak, but no words came out. The guilt and horror of what I had done overwhelmed me, and I felt tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." Emily's form began to change, her features twisting into something dark and malevolent. "You are bound by blood," she said, her voice a sinister echo of the Illuminati's. "You have no choice but to obey." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. It had been a dream, but it felt so real. The voices in my head were laughing, mocking me. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it filled me with despair. I spent days in a haze of fear and guilt, trying to come up with a way out. But the Illuminati's control over me was too strong, and I knew I couldn't escape. The final task loomed over me, a dark cloud that I couldn't shake. One night, I made my decision. I would perform the ritual, but I would choose my own target. I would find someone who deserved it, someone whose death would not weigh as heavily on my conscience. It was a twisted compromise, but it was the only way I could live with myself. I found my target in one of the guards, a man named Rogers. He was cruel and sadistic, taking pleasure in the suffering of the inmates. I knew he deserved to die, and I felt a twisted sense of justice in choosing him. The night of the ritual, I waited until Rogers was alone. I lured him to the hidden area of the prison, just as I had done with Mark. He was suspicious, but I convinced him with a lie about finding contraband. When we reached the ritual site, I struck quickly, plunging the knife into his side. Roger's eyes widened in shock, and he tried to fight back, but I overpowered him. As he bled out on the floor, I recited the incantations, the air growing thick with dark energy. The shadows in the room pulsed with power, and I felt the presence of the Illuminati watching me. When the ritual was complete, I felt a surge of dark energy fill me, binding me even closer to the Illuminati. The voices in my head congratulated me, telling me I had done well, but all I felt was emptiness and despair. I had taken another life, and there was no turning back. I'm still trapped in this nightmare, bound by blood and darkness. The Illuminati's control over me is absolute, and I know my time is running out. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I had to share this part of my story. If you're reading this, please stay away from the dark web and the promises of power it offers. It's a trap, and once you're caught, there's no escape. May God have mercy on my soul. Hey Reddit, this will be my last post. The Illuminati have demanded the ultimate price, and there's no escape this time. My descent into darkness is complete, and I need to share the final part of my story before it's too late. After the sacrifice of Rogers, the prison was in chaos. The guards were terrified, and the inmates were more restless than ever. The dark energy that permeated the place was palpable, and everyone could feel it. The Illuminati's influence was spreading, and I was at the center of it all. The voices in my head were louder, more insistent. They told me that the final ritual was upon me, that I needed to make the ultimate sacrifice to secure my place in their ranks. I knew what they wanted, another innocent life, someone close to me. I felt sick to my core, knowing what I had to do. The only person I could think of was my mother. She was the last person in my family who still believed in me, who still visited me despite everything. The thought of harming her was unbearable, but the Illuminati's grip on me was too strong. I was a puppet, and they were pulling the strings. I received another letter, this time with detailed instructions for the final ritual. It was to be performed outside the prison, in a remote location. They had arranged for my temporary release, using their influence to manipulate the system. I was to meet them at a secluded cabin in the woods, where the final ritual would take place. The day of my release, I felt like a condemned man walking to the gallows. My mother picked me up, her face filled with hope and love. It broke my heart to see her like that, knowing what I was about to do. I tried to push the guilt aside, focusing on the task at hand. We drove to the cabin in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. When we arrived, I saw the familiar symbols drawn around the area, the candles already lit. The air was cold and filled with a sense of dread. The voices in my head urged me on, telling me I had no choice. I led my mother inside, her eyes wide with confusion. She asked me what we were doing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I went through the motions, setting up the ritual, just as I had done before. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. As I recited the incantations, the air grew thick with dark energy. My mother started to panic, begging me to stop, but I was beyond reason, driven by fear and the overwhelming presence of the Illuminati. I picked up the knife, my vision blurring with tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." I brought the knife down, and the world seemed to shatter around me. The ground trembled, and the shadows in the room came alive, swirling and twisting. My mother's screams echoed in my ears, mixing with the malevolent whispers of the Illuminati. I felt a surge of dark energy fill me, binding me completely to their will. When it was over, I collapsed on the floor, covered in blood and tears. The voices in my head were louder than ever, congratulating me on my success. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I knew the Illuminati had claimed me fully. The power I felt was overwhelming, but so was the crushing guilt and despair. The authorities found me hours later, in a daze, my mother's lifeless body beside me. I was arrested and charged with her murder, and the news spread like wildfire. The world saw me as a monster, and maybe they were right. I had done unspeakable things, and there was no redemption for me. I'm writing this from my cell, knowing that my time is almost up. The Illuminati's final demand is clear. My life is the last sacrifice. They want me to end it all, to complete the cycle of blood and darkness. I can feel their presence, their malevolent eyes watching me, waiting for me to fulfill my final duty. I don't know if anyone will believe this, but I had to tell my story. The Illuminati are real, and they will destroy everything you love. They will take your soul, your sanity, and your life. If you're reading this, please stay away from the dark web and the promises of power it offers. It's a trap, and once you're caught, there's no escape. May God have mercy on my soul. Goodbye, Reddit.